strong and thriving civil society isn't just a good thing in itself. It's absolutely essential to the future of this country. I was elected 4 years ago in 2010, and before that I spent a decade working in the voluntary sector with children and young people, firstly through youth homelessness charity, and then running our work with refugee and migrant families at the Children's Society. And during that time, one of the things that I saw was that despite huge intervention from the government, that the lives of many of those children and young people quite simply weren't getting better, and they weren't getting better for a number of reasons, but partly because actually government didn't know how to reach some of those children and young people, and actually it's local communities, it's civil society organisations, charities, community groups, youth services who really do understand how to, not just how to reach those children and young people, but how to help them and help them to help themselves. And I think we have huge challenges as a country, huge challenges around the severe constraints on public finances at the moment and for the foreseeable future. We have an ageing population, we have huge problems of loneliness, of isolation, we have huge and growing inequality in our communities, challenges of poverty with the rise of food banks across the country. We've got a real crisis of youth unemployment, and particularly long-term youth unemployment. Although there are nearly 1 million young people out of work, there are some young people who've been out of work for a very long time, and that is a real problem in towns and villages and cities across this country. And problems in areas like mine in Wigan of long-term worklessness as well, and the huge problems that create social problems for families and for communities. And in my view, it is only by tapping into the widest range of voices and talents and energy and passion and commitment that we're going to be able to solve some of these problems. You know, when I sit in Parliament, I often listen to politicians on all sides of the political divide arguing about whether the state and the market is best placed to solve some of these problems. But I think you only have to look at recent examples like Southern Cross or the work programme to realise that actually the state and the market don't offer those magic bullet solutions that we're all so desperately searching for. Meanwhile, I've been, in the last few months since I've been doing this job as the Shadow Minister, I've been out and about across the country looking at some of the things that are happening in communities like this. So in Coventry, for example, there's a project run by an organisation called Grapevine and the Coventry Law Centre that aims to work with local communities to empower people who are having problems and under strain in order to find the right solutions for their own lives. That sort of project works. It works in a way that a programme like the work programme can't work, because it starts from where people actually are, from their family, from their friends, from their neighbours. It starts with the strengths that exist already in communities and the assets that people have and that they bring. And really what it does is it shifts the attention from the problems that people pose to the potential that they have. And for all of you in this room who do this sort of work in your local communities, you'll know that you never solve problems by starting with problems, by starting with a negative approach that says, you know, these are the problems that we have. You have to start with the potential that people have. And I think there are the civil society organisations that we have, largely speaking, are best placed to do that and to understand it. I think the great lesson here is that every community across this country has its own challenges and its own personal strengths. What works in Ipswich doesn't work in Immingham, and I think we've learned that over a long, long time because of failed state interventions, because of failed market solutions, and because of the huge national programmes that, you know, schemes cooked up in Whitehall and imposed on communities across the country don't work. And the reason that they don't work is severalfold. It's not just that they're often too overly bureaucratic, it's not just that often they're far too prescriptive, it's not just that actually quite a lot of the time, because they're cooked up in Whitehall and then imposed in places like Wigan, where I'm from, they don't tackle the right problems. It's also that when you impose things on local communities, you squeeze the life out of those communities, you squeeze the energy and the commitment out of them, and you take away that sense of ownership that that people feel, because those projects have sprung up because there was local need, and they're sustained and they persist because people feel ownership of them and drive them forward because they feel that they belong. And you know, it's not just that we've got this real problem at the moment in terms of the public finances and huge constraints, which is having a knock-on effect on civil society. But look at the flip side of that. In local communities like mine, like this one, there is a huge wealth of energy, of creativity, of passion. Despite really, really difficult circumstances, people are springing up and finding their own solutions. They're volunteering to keep libraries going until we can afford to properly staff them again. They're manning local food banks to help people keep going in really difficult times. And whilst I would never celebrate the fact that we've got food banks, I do celebrate the fact that despite real strain and real difficulty, people are finding solutions to some of these really, really pressing problems. And it's only by tapping into that huge wealth of energy and creativity and passion that exists in local communities and in civil society, in those community groups, in those youth clubs, in those grassroots sports clubs, in those law centres, in those local charities. It's only by tapping into that we're going to solve some of these problems. But I wanted to say this because I think this report today is so relevant, and it's one of the reasons why when Mark and James got in touch with me, I was so keen to come and hear a bit more about it. Because civil society can only be as strong as the people that are involved in it. And I think we have to face the fact, just listening to those findings, that actually we have real problems in relation to the people who are involved in some of those civil society organisations. I think we need to face the fact that the charitable sector is not representative too often of not just of the general population, but actually of the beneficiaries of those organisations as well. If you look at the charitable sector, what you find is that people with disabilities, that people from minority ethnic backgrounds are hugely underrepresented, but particularly underrepresented at the higher levels. And when you get to the higher levels of charitable organisations, and particularly the larger organisations, what you tend to find is that it's dominated by older white men, which is the same as many leadership positions across the country, and it's something that we ought to be really worried about, but it's also something that the sector ought to be worried about too, because charities' greatest strength, its value in the eyes of the public is its integrity. And charities that bear little or no resemblance to their own beneficiaries cannot survive the long run and cannot solve the problems that those beneficiaries have. I think we need to recognise something else as well. And Mark and James touched on it, but they didn't. It's not the focus of today, but it's really important, which is that there is a huge inequality in terms of the time and the resources and the confidence and the skills and the education and the social connections between some communities and others, and between some individuals and others. And it's not enough to say that charities need to just pull people in from society without recognising that those inequalities exist, that some people are under enormous strain. In my constituency, many of my constituents work 2 or 3 jobs just to try and make ends meet, and still end up at the end of the week with very little money, struggling to pay their gas bills or put food on the table for their children. And we need to understand that actually in areas like mine and some other communities across the country, that is compounded by the fact that so many families are in that situation too. And it's not good enough just to say, well, they need to volunteer and they need to come and run their local library, when they're trying to keep their families and their lives afloat. So we have to recognise that there are those inequalities, and I think we have to recognise that therefore there is a role for government in trying to support people in order to rebuild civil society. And I think that's why what you're doing here in Ipswich is so very important, because building that capacity in local communities has to be a partnership. Has to be a partnership between civil society, between local and national government, and with the private sector as well, to get the widest range of voices involved in running charities, in volunteering, in organising in the local community. And it's great that the lottery is supporting some of this work. It's fantastic, and I think there are some really far-reaching funders out there. Some of them were mentioned before, Esme Fairburn, like Kelly Chase, and the lottery, who understand the importance of putting a bit of investment into this at the start to help things to flourish. But I think there is a really strong role for government as well. And I think the lesson of the last few years has been that this idea that the state can step aside and civil society will flourish is a myth. That actually there is a really strong role for government at local and national level to support civil society, not just to sustain what we already have, but to enable those organisations to thrive and reach more people. And that when you take an approach that says the state just steps out of the way, what you find is what we're seeing across the country, which is that some of those organisations that are best able to adapt and survive, to draw on social investment or private finance, are not necessarily those organisations that we most need, not necessarily those organisations who are closest to the people that we're trying to support and we're trying to help. So I just briefly wanted to say some of the things that I think government does have a role in, and I've been out and about for the last few months since I got this job, talking to people, listening to people in all parts of the country. One of the first things that people say to me wherever I go is that there is a real problem in terms of the infrastructure and the support that's out there for civil society organisations. I think the demise of the regional development agencies has been problematic, and their replacement with local enterprise partnerships which don't necessarily have charities and other civil society organisations represented at the highest levels. It's not just the demise of the RDAs, it's also the many local councils are under pressure. They've lost staff who had expertise in relation to the sector, local grants officers, for example. Particular problem for smaller charities in terms of knowing where to go to get help and advice and support. And I think there is a job for government to try to rebuild some of that infrastructure and make sure that that support is there. I think the loss of grants has been really problematic in favour of contracts, and I say this not as a party political point, because actually that's something that really started when my party was in government last, but has continued in recent years. I think this is problematic because what we've seen across the country is a loss of some of those pioneering projects, the ones that took risks, that didn't always work. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they failed, but they're the sorts of things that the voluntary sector is so fantastic at. And the community sector is taking risks, trying new ways of doing things, innovating, and providing lessons, I think, for the public sector and the private sector in how you can do things differently and do things better. I think we need to look really seriously about trying to restore some of that grant giving to organisations as well. I think there's a role for government in supporting the sector to grow its own talent. One of the reasons I think that charity leadership often looks so unrepresentative is because I saw very clearly for myself when I worked in the sector that quite often when you went to the front line, the staff that we had would look and sound and be very like the beneficiaries, the children and young people that we were working with. But as you got higher and higher up the organisation, those people would disappear. It was like almost as if there was a glass ceiling that people would hit and then they weren't able to break through. And you know, there's been huge controversy about chief executive pay in charities. I think it's overblown and overstated. Most charities are small and local, and most chief executives could only dream of earning hundreds of thousands of pounds. But one of the reasons those criticisms exist is because charity CEOs are largely drawn from the public and private sectors, and that is partly a consequence of the fact that charities are not good enough at growing their own talent. And there is a role for government, I think, in supporting that. And as your local MP, Ben Gummer, said in advance of the launch today, let's get a much more diverse range of people into leadership positions. He was talking about Ipswich, but of course that sentiment goes for right across the country. We need to do that. We need to do it to reach the right people and to get the right solutions. And finally, just this, that I think there is another role for government as well, which is to free up local government to be able to co-design and co-deliver projects at a local level that work for local people, projects and services. So I saw a really great example recently in Lambeth where they've handed youth services over to the community. It's held in trust by the community, and at least some of those services are not just designed but delivered by young people themselves, because they know best what they need and what they want, not a group of people sitting in the town hall designing it for them. And there is a role for government too, not just in terms of what it does, but in terms of the way that it behaves. So one of the things that has happened over recent years, I think, is that the commissioning processes, the procurement processes for services have become so cumbersome and bureaucratic and difficult that we shut out the very people that we most need to include through those processes. And I have real concerns about what payment by results has meant for smaller organisations who can't afford to fund those services up front, because these are often the very organisations who are already doing that work with the people that we're trying to reach. So you look at the work programme, for example, and you contract G4S to do that, but only to find that G4S then have to go and find that small local organisation who is already doing that work. It seems to me madness that we don't cut out the middleman and go directly to those organisations too. So just lastly, I wanted to say this. I don't think that this is a way of doing things on the cheap. I talked about the strain on public finances, but actually doing this well and doing this properly, reviving civil society, allowing organisations to thrive, drawing on the widest range of voices. This is something that is difficult. It is time and resource intensive. It requires partnership between local, national, government, the civil society organisations themselves, local people, and the private sector. But there is, just as I think this is difficult and this is something that requires investment, there is no doubt in my mind at all that it's something that we have to do to invest in our communities, to draw on the widest range of voices, to draw on the widest set of talents that we have, and ultimately because the end game really in all of this is about giving people more control, not just over their own communities but over their own lives as well. Everywhere I go in the country, that's what I hear from people, is what they need and what they want. This is the only way that we're going to achieve it. So thank you so much for hosting this event today, and thank you for having me. And I'll be around for a while, so it'd be really great to be able to talk a bit more with you and understand a bit more about what's happening here in Ipswich. Thanks.